Hi, it's Dale. Here's a short review of what we went over last week regarding jussive verbs. So just to review where we are on the chart, we're on the last line. So we've talked about perfect and imperfect already in class. So now we're jumping down to the jussive forms, which are on the last row. The jussive is a prefixed form, so we need to know what the prefixes are, and here they are. If you study these, you'll notice that the jussive prefixes are exactly like the imperfect prefixes, or we should say prefixes, and in some case, suffixes. The translation value, however, is a little bit different for the jussive. So if we look at the top line, our third person masculine singular, which has a yod prefix, instead of being translated he will hear, is translated let him hear or he may hear. And this works all the way down the pattern. So instead of being translated as future tense, it's this idea of sometimes excuse me, linguists call volition, or the idea of allowing somebody to do something, or even wishing that somebody would do something, or kind of expressing a desire that something would happen in the future, but not making any definite statement about what that future looks like. So these are exactly the same. There are also some special first person forms that are referred to as the cohortative. And if you studied Greek, the equivalent term in Greek is called the hortatory, but it's the same idea. And these special forms only apply to first person. So the first person cohortative form would be eshma'a, and the first person common plural would be nishma'a. And the difference between these forms and what you would see in the jussive, if you look at those last two forms on this chart, are that these forms are marked by a special comets hey at the end. So these are yet again another place where comets hey is drawn in to give a word some sort of special marking or meaning. So if you see something that looks like an imperfect, you look at the root, but yet you see this hey, what looks like a hey suffix. That's probably cohortative or some sort of other object suffix, but probably cohortative unless there's a mapik in the hay, that little dot in the hay. These aren't terribly common, but you will run into them on occasion. So when we parse a jussive verb, we do it just like we would an imperfect or perfect. We would say cal jussive, third masculine plural from the root pe kov dalet. So we're just differentiating that it is a jussive versus an imperfect. Now, if you don't know whether it's jussive or imperfect because the two are identical, most people, with no other context, most people would just parse the particular verb as imperfect. But jussive wouldn't be wrong because you really cannot tell the difference between the two. So it could be jussive, probably imperfect though, because simply because imperfects are more common. It's translation value. So again, we said the jussive verbs have this idea of allowing or letting or wishing that things would happen. May he, let him. So this is important because the jussive forms almost always look exactly like the imperfect. For all practical purposes, the jussive becomes a translation option for verbs that look like imperfect verbs. So you run across a verb and you say, this looks like imperfect. But in the back of your mind, you should always remember that it could be a jussive form. So that's just another option for translation, and context and your own judgment should tell you whether it's jussive or imperfect, because just the form itself doesn't tell you definitively. So you have to use your own judgment to determine whether something is jussive or imperfect. So, in essence, the translation value of the imperfect, and I put this in quotes because you can't tell the difference between imperfect and jussive, are first off future tense. So, that's probably your first thing that you want to try. But there's also these ideas that linguists often call modal. So, could, would, should, may, might. So, instead of something like he will hear, um, it could be something like he could hear, he would hear, he should hear, he may hear, he might hear. Oh, that he would hear. Something like that, that idea. So all of those things are options. Um, and they're just good things to keep in mind if you're doing translation work, that these other options might fit better under the circumstances of your particular translation project. So there is one truly major exception to the jussive being the exact same form as the imperfect. And this is in the case of third hey and middle vav or yod verbs. And if you'd like some examples of this, look at page 235 and Seao. And he has a nice chart there that compares the imperfect and the jussive. So let's look at a very common example. So the call imperfect um, of the root hey yod hey to be um, looks like this top form, the call imperfect yih yay. And so this is something like he will be or it will be. But notice the difference between that form, the imperfect, and the jussive form. And one thing you'll notice is that the vowel markings are a bit different, but probably the most prominent difference is the fact that the third hey has dropped out. So for jussive forms, third hey goes away, and that is a pervasive rule for the jussive. And there are also some various rules for the middle vav or yod that you should take a look at. So they aren't always the same. And in those cases, we can tell when a verb is adjussive. So look at this example from Genesis 1:3. Vayomer Elohim, so and God said, Yihyeh or, Vayhi or. So the Yihyeh, the third word in this verse, means let it be or may it be light. And then you'll notice the next, so this would be the second last word attached to the final noun with a dash, is a vav consecutive. And if you ignore the vav consecutive looks exactly like the jussive. So let it be light, and then the last form attached with a dash is and it was light. So this brings us to a discussion of the vav consecutive verbs, which we've been talking about for a long time already. We talked about these last quarter in class, but now we've formally hit them in the course. So vav consecutive are the top line, and almost every verb form has a vav consecutive form. So the vav consecutive is really vav plus jussive. And we haven't talked about this yet because we haven't learned jussive forms, but now we have. So this is how vav consecutives are put together or assembled. They have vavs, and then they have the jussive form of the verb. So the first element of the vav consecutive is, of course, the vav, and that's always there. The second element is always, always, always the prefix, which marks or helps mark person, number, and gender. And there's no variability here. The next sign or the next letter is always a prefix. And then finally we have the root. And the root for this particular verb is aleph mem resh, which means to say or speak. So it always follows this pattern: vav, prefix, and root. Always, always. Let's look at another verb where we have some complications. So here we have vav, and then we have prefix, but we only have 2 letters left, and we know that based on our rules of Hebrew that we need a 3-letter root. So in this case, this particular verb vayar comes from the root resh aleph hey, and the third hey has dropped away. And we said that in all jussive forms, the third hey drops away. So we're not surprised at all that the third hey is gone here. So this particular verb, vayar, means and he saw. From the same passage in Genesis, and he saw that what God saw that what he had created is good. So if you're down to 2 letters and you don't have a 3-letter root, third hey is often your solution to that problem, and I think always should be your first guess unless you're really familiar with the verb and you already know that something else might be going on in the verb. Notice that in the vav consecutive, it's nearly always with a patach, sometimes a kamet, so the T-shaped vowel, but never, ever, ever with a schwa. So if you see a vav with a schwa before a word, it's either preceding a noun or it's preceding probably a perfect verb. So don't confuse vav consecutive with vav plus a noun or vav plus a perfect verb. So this is, if you can keep this little rule in mind, that will really help you at least understand the form of the words that you're reading, and it helps you differentiate even between nouns and verbs. So this is a really handy rule to keep in mind. So the translation value of a vav consecutive is nearly always past tense. So this is much, much, much easier than the imperfect. We said the imperfect has sort of future tense, but then also all these other possibilities. So for the vav consecutive, our first go-to should always be past tense. And you will be right, I would say 98% of the time. So let's look at some unusual verbs in the imperfect. So these will be just as unusual in the vav consecutive. So now even though we've shown you differences where vav consecutive or where imperfects and jussives are a little bit different, or vav consecutives by definition, and the imperfects are different, these are kind of have the same problems in both the imperfect and the vav consecutive. So let's look at this first set of words. I'm going to show you the third masculine singular for all these. So this is the imperfect of the root he lamed kaf, and the imperfect third masculine singular is yelech. So the yod is our marker of third masculine singularity. But notice that the root is he lamed kaf. So in this case, when the root he lamed kaf encountered the yod, the he dropped out. So he is very weak. In the battle between yod and he, yod will always win. So the he drops out. So our imperfect form is yelech. If it was you or feminine, it would be telech. So it just kind of follows that same vowel pattern. Here's another root, very common. So the imperfect third person masculine singular from the root nun taf nun is yitain. So in this case, the yod and the nun confronted each other at the beginning of that root, and the yod wins. Nun is very weak. In the case of the nun, though, it assimilates, and the next root letter is doubled or gets a dagesh if it can take a dagesh. So that's your clue that a nun has dropped out. Again, these verbs that I'm showing you, particularly these first two, are very, very, very common, even though they're irregular, I guess, or do some irregular things. So they show up a lot, and it's good to be familiar with them just on their own. Here's another oddball verb. So imperfect third masculine singular for he will take is yikach, and it's from the root lamed kov chet. And this is the only place in the language that I can think of or know of where a lamed has become weak and has dropped out. So you'll notice that the root has a lamed, but the imperfect form does not. And in this case, the battle between Yod and Lamed was again won by Yod. And we have a nice dagesh in the kof, which reminds us that something has dropped out. So kind of our first instinct, if we didn't know anything about this verb, we might think that the first letter of the root was nun, but in this case, it happened to be lamed. So this is truly an oddball situation because lameds don't normally drop out. But again, a very common verb, giving and taking. As you can imagine, those are both very common. Next, let's look at Yod Dalet Ayin, and the imperfect is Yeda. So he will know. And if we took the root Yod Dalet Ayin and we added on a Yod prefix, so we would have two Yods in a row, for this particular root, one of the Yods drops out. So we end up with Yeda instead of two Yods. Very similar phenomenon for the root Yashav to and this should say, instead of he will know, it should say he will sit, or he will stay, or he will dwell. Sorry, I didn't get that fixed from class time. But again, it's yeshev. And so one yod has dropped out. I guess since all imperfect verbs have their prefix, you can comfortably say that the yod from the root has dropped out. And then one other, again, truly oddball verb that Sayao talks about is a root yod kaf lamed, meaning to be able. And in this case, we get an u vowel replacing the yod, I guess, if you want to think about it this way, replacing the yod in the root. We get a shurik vowel. Just very strange, but that's the way these particular forms go, and Sayao gives this particular verb its own chart because it is so unusual the way this imperfect is formed. Anyway, be familiar or aware of these roots and look at the chart that you got in class to try to help you if you're looking particularly at a Vav consecutive and trying to figure out what has dropped out, but just know that the Vav is the Vav. The next letter is always, always, always the prefix, and then you have to figure out how many letters you're left with and what root they point to. Hope that helps. I know this is a quick review. Let me know if you have questions. Thanks.